Hello, this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith with iChess, and you are watching a DVD called Endgame Renaissance, where I'll be presenting 6 hours of hopefully instructive endgame examples played either in tournaments around the world throughout the last few years or from my own games. So I can not completely guarantee you, but largely guarantee you that these will not be examples you've seen before. We're not going to be seeing ancient classical endgames played by Capablanca. The focus of this DVD will be on practical endgames. So while of course there's going to be many theoretical positions touched upon, and you can definitely broaden your knowledge of the basic positions of endgame theory, which one should know via this DVD, the focus is going to be on the ideas played of endgames played with more pieces than just a few. And the methods of play used in more complex endgames. So this DVD will consist of 6 different chapters. The first one will be transitions. So very important, of course, in the endgame is knowing which pieces to exchange, which pieces to keep, and to be willing sometimes to change the nature of the position, hopefully to your advantage. So we discuss exchanges into king and pawn ending, as well as other kinds of exchanges which change the nature of the play and how to manage this kind of transitions. In Chapter 2, we see this eternal battle between bishop against knight. These two pieces, not just in the endgame, but also in the middle game, but especially in the endgame, the bishop and knight have their own specific characteristics and qualities, and their battle often defines the game. So we'll see some methods used to carry out this battle, and we'll see examples where one piece, the bishop or the knight, is superior, so you can better assess a coming position with such an imbalance. Then we have the section on initiative. Just as in the middle game, the player calling the shots obviously is a major advantage. So while in the endgame, slow positional features may be important, just at the same time, dynamics and attack and these kinds of things, the initiative basically, are also important. So there's some examples even of attack on the opponent's king with the queens off the board in the endgame, which can happen. We also see some kind of long-term initiative flowing from greater centralization in some of the examples in this series as well. Then, in the 4th chapter, I show strategic sacrifices. We'll see examples of player offering an exchange, primarily to gain some kind of advantage that even in the endgame, sacrifices obviously occur as well, and we see some examples of that. And then the last 2 chapters are focused on one is pawn endgames, which is fundamental for endgames. We're not going to see basic theoretical positions there, but we're going to be seeing we'll be seeing more complex pawn endings, which can be quite interesting. We'll also, then the final chapter will be rook endings, which rook endings are also fundamental to endgames. And I chose rook and pawn. Obviously, we have minor piece endings elsewhere in the video. I chose those two because they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the style of play. The pawn ending is very concrete and slow. Rook ending, players have enormous possibilities because of the great mobility of the rook. So it's kind of different ways of thinking, and that's why I chose those two. So I'm hoping you will enjoy this DVD. I hope that you'll find a lot of instructional value. And I wish you the best of luck in any tournaments you're playing and in your chess in general. The subject of this chapter will be transitions. We're going to be looking at the exchange of pieces and how it alters the game. The right way to make to make a transition. In one case, an example of a very wrong way to change from a queen pawn ending to a pure pawn ending. So we'll see my game against Grandmaster Alexander Lenderman where that happened. We'll see another game that I played where I made a number of different transitions in order to improve the remaining pieces compared to their counterparts. And then we'll see a very fascinating endgame where a player with an extra piece went into seemingly winning position with the pawns on one side of the board, but this endgame carried more subtleties than what you would normally imagine from such a position.
Here we'll see that it's how absolutely crucial it is to carefully calculate before you enter a pawn endgame, because in a king and pawn ending, generally speaking, the die is cast. It's possible to calculate the position to complete certainty, and the play becomes forcing, essentially. Almost the same as starting a forcing combination in the middle game. So to illustrate this, we'll see my game that I played with the white pieces here against Grandmaster Alexander Lenderman. This game took place in Virginia in 2017. We've reached this position, and basically it's queen and pawns, and both kings are open, so the game is pretty likely to lead to a draw. Both at some point somebody will be in perpetual check. So for instance, he could play queen c7, hitting the pawn on c3, but then I could just take on d6, and after queen takes c3, queen e4 perhaps is one way to play it. I mean, probably others as well, but this one prepares to invade with the queen to a8, to b7, also aims toward the h-pawn, and it attacks this pawn. So really, white is of course fine here, and black should start checking the white king. However, my opponent still wanted to try to win, and so he played the move queen f7, but he didn't calculate enough the possibility of the trade of queens. Maybe missed something, but as he played the move a little bit fast, I think you have to be much more cautious entering king and pawn ending from this position. And as it turned out, this move was a fatal mistake. So I now traded queens. And the funny thing was that here it was even possible to play queen e4. If the queens couldn't be traded, this would be drawish then. He would take the h-pawn, and I would start checking his king with perpetual eventually. But queen takes f7 was much better. King takes f7, and now the key point was that perhaps he missed, or he counted on e takes d6, or assumed that he would reach the same position after d takes e5, but it wasn't the case. I now played king f3, and this is a crucial subtlety which wins the game for white. Instead, e takes d6 would lose. His plan was then, of course, he plays e5, so he's going to take my d-pawn, and then he has a passed pawn in the center, whereas I can't easily create a passed pawn on the queen side because my c-pawn is backward. So for instance, I play king f3, king e6, king e4, king takes d6, and the problem is that I can't play c4 because b takes c4, and there's no king d4 move because his pawn is already on e5. Of course, if I could follow up with king to d4, I would regain my pawn, and then I would have the outside passed pawn after a4 and b5. But here it doesn't work. And meanwhile, if I don't play c4, for instance, if king to d3, king to d5, and I won't succeed in playing c4, and he'll keep pushing me back with e4, king e3, king e5, and just keep marching the white king backwards until it runs out of moves, and I have to start throwing away pawns. Or let's say a3, king e6 again, though eventually the white king has to retreat. King goes back, king d5, and so on, and he can keep pushing my king back, or he could also divert it and go and take my queenside pawns, but clearly black wins. So that was the idea, but I managed with king f3 to avoid it. So here he realized probably his mistake. He played d5. The point is that if d takes e5, trying to reach the same position with the passed pawn in the center and my backward c pawn. However, the difference is here he won't get his pawn to e5, so I'll succeed in playing c4. So king e4, king e7. After other moves, I'm also taking his e-pawn and following up the same way. King e5, king d7, c4. This was the idea if he would play this way. And now he has to take the pawn, otherwise I play c5 with a passed pawn, and then eventually I will push it to c6 and take his e-pawn and then squeeze his king, or take the kingside pawns afterwards. So he takes king d4, and I get my pawn back. And now the problem is that for black is that reach a position where I'll have an outside passed pawn versus a center passed pawn, and in many king and pawn innings this is decisive. So the problem is for him, I'm going to play a4 and b5, create a passed pawn on the b file, and his king will have to go and deal with that pawn. He'll be diverted over to the b file, while I will go with my king to take his e-pawn. So when he takes my pawn on b5, my king will already be coming up, or wherever it is on the b file, my king will already be on e6 somewhere, and then I'll go and take his kingside pawns. My king will be closer. So this is why the outside passed pawn in king and pawn inning is so important. So just to see how it works out roughly, of course many ways to play, but it's going to come to the same thing. King c6, a4, e5 let's say, b5, takes, king d6, king d5, king takes b5, king takes e5. And now the white king is closer and will take black's pawns inevitably and win. So king c6, let's say, king e6, king c5, king f7, king d6, king g7, king e6, king h7, etc. I queen my g-pawn. So instead he played d5. And also should check king e7. If he tries to hope that I take on d6, which obviously I'm not going to do, I will continue bringing my king up, king e4. And now if d takes e5, king takes e5 transposes to what we just looked at. If he continues king d7, then king d4. Once again, I'm continuing my journey. d5 is going to transpose to the game. D takes e5 will transpose to what we just looked at, essentially. And if he plays king c6, only now do I take on d6, finally. Not any other move, because then he could play d5 and lock it up. So if I try to use some sort of tempo move like a3, then d5 would lock up the game, and his king would move back and forth on c6 and b6. So that would be a draw. But only once his king reaches c6, then I take. Now he will have spent a move, so he has to take the pawn, and now I get to play c4 again. He didn't get the pawn to e5 in time. And we reach the same sort of thing after e5, king c3, and now if he takes on c4, king takes c4 is the same as we just saw. If he tries to hold the position and allow me the protected passed c-pawn, then I also lose his c5, king d5, king d3, and he either retreats to c6 or e6 because he's out of moves. And I still have, if necessary, even another tempo, but right now it's black's move. If king c6, then king e4, and I take his e-pawn and easily win. If king e6, king e4 also, and his king is running out of moves. So even h6, g6 still, his king will be unable to, for instance, king f5, king d5, and I'll queen my c-pawn, or I'll take his e-pawn. So he played d5, but the black king is one move too slow, reaching the c6 square, and one move extra, reaching c7. We'll see how this works. I played king e3, so my plan is simple: to bring my king up and invade. There's nothing he can do on the king side. Always in all these positions, g6 is met by h6, and h6 is met by g6, which doesn't change anything. Here he decided to play g6. Of course, I played h6, and now he resigned, seeing what's going to happen. King e7, king d4. So my king is just coming up. King d7, king c5. If he had if he had reached c6, of course the game would be drawn. If he was already on c6 here, if it was black's move, king c6, then he could hold a fortress with the king on b6 and c6. But instead, I'm reaching c5. He's just in time to bar the entry, but the problem is now I have a spare move, which is a crucial point to win the game for white. Black is in Zugzwang. He has to move his king, and either way I invade with my own king. King d7, king b6, and I take his a-pawn, or king b7, king d6, and I take his e-pawn. And he has no waiting moves. So if we notice this position, everything from the start, if the white pawn were already on a3, the game would be drawn. That little detail, whether it's on a2 or a3, hung the result of the game. But it's on a2, so I can move a3 and black loses. That's why he resigned. Sometimes the decisive straw that breaks the camel's back in a position where you have an advantage is some kind of simplification or a transition, changing the kind of pieces on the board in order to obtain some kind of advantage as a result. So we'll see an illustration of that in this part of my game from Philadelphia 2010. My opponent was named a national master named Kelly. And okay, so here it's white's move. Black has just played b5 in a bid to get some counterplay. He's under pressure by white having more space and two bishops in control of the a file. So black's attempting to open some lines on the queen side and maybe open the b file and bring the rook to b2, something like that, while hoping that his knights can hold down the center of the board, keeping his king safe and blocking the action of my rook on a7. However, white now has a way to simplify the game and gain a decisive advantage. So what I did was rook takes d7. So first I sacrificed the exchange. And this is, of course, just a temporary sacrifice. But we'll see that I'm required to give up one of my two bishops. As a result of this combination. This is important to be flexible when you have two bishops. One of the advantages is that you can, at the right moment, very easily trade one off. It's a lot easier to trade bishops for knights than reverse, because bishops can sort of like take aim at knights in a way that knights can't. So one of the advantages of two bishops is that you tend to have more options to trade them and to use that, be ready to use that at the last moment, not to cling to them. The resulting pieces after this exchange will be it will increase white's initiative. The remaining pieces on the board will be only the white pieces playing. But black has to take with the knight and rook a7, attacking the knight on d7. And obviously, if I take that knight, the two bishops against a rook will be easily winning for white. So black had to protect with rook to d8. And now came bishop a5. So clearly black won't be able to move the rook from d8, and so white will regain the exchange at the right moment, and it doesn't have to be immediately. Black's pieces won't get away. So here my opponent played b takes c4. Obviously I'm threatening to take on b5, because if his rook takes back on b5, then I'll have bishop takes d8 check, and he won't be able to recapture with the rook there, so I'll win the knight on d7 for free. So he has to deal with the threat to his b-pawn, and so he took on c4. He could consider b4, which doesn't win a pawn, unlike the move in the game, but also doesn't allow a way through with the queen side. The pawn on c4 that he gets is pretty useless, and it's only a question of how much time I take to capture that pawn. This, however, wouldn't free him from his troubles. After h5, this move is something white's going to play at some moment in all these situations. It's my intention to play h5 as soon as possible, because I fix the king side. So now, always in some later case, I can come in on the light squares, and he won't be able to remove his pawn from g7. And basically, it's an advantage to have these one pawn holding back his two. So g7 is now a weakness. So it's hard to find moves for black. Basically, he can play rook a8, in which case I take on d8, or he can play king e8. But next I'm going to take on d8, and going to reach a position where black essentially can't do anything. So let's say bishop e6 here.
maybe also bishop f5 is good as well. Not much difference. Let's say bishop f5 too. Either one. And here's the problem for black is that he has no moves at all. If his knight moves from d7, I take on g7. His rook can't move from d8. So only thing he can do is e7 to e8 with his king and just hope I can't break through. But obviously I can. So I have many ways to do it. In particular, I can use my king to head up to f5, which he can't stop. And then finally, when the king gets to f5, then I'll make the exchange on d7, going into king and pawn ending, and then king g6 at the end. Win his g-pawn, and then the h-pawn, and queen my own h-pawn. That's the plan, and there's no stopping it. The only thing black can do is just play, for instance, knight to b6, but then white would have rook takes g7, knight takes c4, and then such things like rook to g6, and white is much faster in the event, for instance, knight e3. He can take my c-pawn, but white's much faster in this case. Not much faster, but one move faster. Queen with check. And then the queen comes behind to b8, so after another check. So this is okay. Maybe there's also some other ways to do this, but yeah. So this was okay. b4 was a try, but as you see, black's losing. So he took on c4. Now I took on e5 to find out how he's going to recapture. I want to know how he's going to recapture and clarify the situation. There are other ways to play, but this was, if you can, to clarify the position. And I knew what both cases I was heading for. I had the idea how to win. So here he took with his d-pawn. The idea, he gives me a passed pawn, but his idea was then he gets d6 for his king. So he has some hope to unpin in a more comfortable way, and maybe even in the future try to play f5 to undermine my e-pawn if my bishop is traded off, let's say. If he took, of course he can't take with the knight because it's pinned. If he took with the f-pawn, then I would have taken on d8 and then h5. Okay, I could also play h5 immediately. And here, once again, there's always this specter of going into king and pawn ending at the right moment. And he can't move his knight from d7. Okay, so king e8 is one. He can either play c3 or king e8. At some point he can play c3 in either case, but let's say king e8. Here, bishop f5. So he can't move his knight, basically. If he moves the knight, then I'm taking a pawn on g7. And white wins easily. He can't take h5 because bishop g6 check. King f8, rook to f7 check. So he just has to move his king back and forth, but king e7, for instance, king f2, king e8, king e3, and next I'll go king d2 and king c3. It didn't take his c-pawn, and finally I'll trade and bring the pieces on d7 and bring my king to b5, and his king will be squeezed out. Then go king a6 at the end. So if, on the other hand, he puts the pawn on c3 and tries to play c3 and c4 to keep my king from, so he creates some sort of barrier for my king. So I actually can't use the plan we just saw. There will be no way through on the queens. Okay, I can maybe go even around to a1 if I want to be that fancy. Maybe it's possible, I don't know. But there's simpler. So I play king f2. Now he can only wait. Once again, if he moves his if he moves his knight, then I'm going to be taking g7. So bishop f5, anchoring my pawn. If knight f6, rook takes g7, and this is just winning for white. It's not just the pawn. In fact, white doesn't have an extra pawn, but black still has no moves, and this h pawn will soon be captured. G4, g5, and white will create a passed pawn, or white can play rook g6. At the g4 and rook g6, for instance. Also threat right now is bishop to g6 check, followed by rook f7, so black has to attend to that. At basically any moment moving his knight away is going to be hopeless. But if he tries to sit and move his king back and forth, first I induce c4 with my king going to e3, threatens king d3, and then I go here, and now I can just, one way of winning, I think there's many other ways, it's just, okay, I can bring my king up the right tempo so he has no knight f6 check, and then only now, finally exchange, rook takes c4, and white will then take c3, and it's truly it is a rook, actually rook and pawn ending, so black's only down one pawn, but it's an easily winning one for white, because still black's pieces are very passive, so his rook can come, let's say, this way, but then I take, and then rook will come either to the 7th or 6th rank, and if his king comes to d7, my king can start to invade via f5. Black has no counterplay, so eventually then g6 and taking g7. I also can put my rook on c6 and push my c-pawn, so it's and even rook c8 followed by rook g8 is also an idea, so there's it's no chance for black. So he took this way, okay, and finally was one more transition. So I brought my king up first, king f2, and black has, okay, I could have also started with h5, I guess, but he doesn't have any way out of the pin, really. If king d6, if king d6, then I have always bishop d6, bishop c7 check, just forcing the king back. So that doesn't help anything. So he played rook a8. If he tried to play h5 to fix kingside pawn so that he avoids my h5, I can win in a different way. I go king e3, rook a8. He has to get out of he has to defuse the situation. Otherwise, if he moves his king back and forth, I'm just going to go and take c4 with my king. So rook a8. Now I take d8. Rook takes. King d2. King d6. Just king c3. And black's pieces. So this was a kind of transition which you don't want to make. You have to, before you go into king and pawn ending, of course, it's very important to calculate carefully. So here he has g6, like I said, king c4, f5. And the problem is, while white has this protected passed pawn, let's say king d3, king d6, c4, black just waits, and white can't make any progress because black will also have his own passed pawn at the right moment. If black didn't have an f pawn, obviously white king could come around this way, but when he starts to go that way, black plays f4. So there's no winning plan possible for white. So you have to be careful always before you go into king and pawn ending. So instead, better is king c3. And now now the knight black has to do something. White will otherwise just take on c4, and after king takes c4, then I'll exchange on d7 because I'll take c5 at the end. So let's say knight to b6, but then I don't need to take the pawn on g7. I can just even more accurately play rook b7 first, attacking the knight, and after knight a4, king takes c4, and now black is without any moves. The knight is stuck. It can be attacked by king b3, and importantly, black's rook can't move from d8 because rook to d7 is checkmate. And if that weren't enough, also g7 pawn is hanging, so white just wins here. So instead, he played rook a8. Now I took on d8. I have to do it now. Finally, he's forced me to take on d8. But the remaining pieces, black stays in the pin on d7, and now I played h5, fixing pawns on the king side. He played king d6, unpinning, and now, before I let his knight escape, I should consider the king and pawn ending. And of course, that was the intention, was to go into it, because it's just winning for white. So I took on d7 with the bishop. It was possible to not go into the ending, but to play some move like king e3, similar to what was before, but if you know for sure the king and pawn ending is winning, you should go into it. So takes, rook takes, and here black resigned, seeing that it's easily winning. After king takes, I have
two ways. Two ways of winning. I believe one was the simplest, which I was intending, which was just to play king f3 and just bring the king up. So if now he waits with the king, so despite the fact that actually I'm down a pawn here, it's winning king and pawn ending. So if he waits, I just come up with a king to f5, and he'll never be able to hold so for instance this defensive position. So my king will come to g6. So for instance c3, d6, c4, g4 is possible. It's not even necessary. Of course d7 also is winning, and then king e7, king g6, and I take his g and h pawn, but g4 is even more accurate. And now I immediately, because it's black's move, I immediately come in with my king to g6 or e6 and win. The other plan was, which I think works also, is g4, stopping a potential f5, and then bringing the king to take black's. Actually, this and then c3, and he can do this, but then I suppose I bring my king around. This is obviously much more long-winded, though. So this was an example of several transitions, from first white giving up the two bishops but remaining with the last two pieces far superior to their counterparts, and then finally the way to force the win by going into the king and pawn ending.